Missouri woman's remains were found weeks after she went missing. Now we're learning the shocking details leading up to her death, as prosecutors say she was tied up to a wheelchair and forced to watch her killer dig her own grave. He put this woman through literally hell and back before shooting her. It's hard to even imagine what kind of human being is capable of doing that. Investigators say it was the victim's ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend who were responsible for the gruesome crime. Apparently, there was a history of abuse. This was not an isolated incident. This is something that built up over time. This is 43-year-old Amy Hogue. She was last seen on June 20th in rural Washington County, Missouri, nearly 75 miles south of St. Louis. Almost right away, Hogue's family knew something was off. Her first grandchild was born just 4 days before her disappearance, and she never had the chance to meet him. They say that was totally out of character. By mid-July, Hogue's purse was found in a river in nearby Jefferson County. Washington County Sheriff Zach Jacobson told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that after finding the purse, they realized she was probably dead at that point. Washington County authorities requested an arrest warrant as the investigation pointed in the direction of Hogue's ex-boyfriend, 36-year-old Tony Charbonneau. Investigators say Charbonneau was a suspect right away because he apparently had a history of violence against Amy Hogue. In May 2023, he allegedly hit Hogue's head so hard that she passed out. At the time of her disappearance, he was in the midst of another case involving Hogue from an October 2023 altercation. At first, the investigation into Hogue's disappearance was stalled because of lack of evidence. The case was placed in rural Missouri in areas where cell phone service is lacking, and there wasn't much of a digital footprint left behind. But a break in the case came when investigators turned to Charbonneau's girlfriend, 40-year-old Brandy Luffy. Luffy confessed to authorities that both she and Charbonneau were responsible for Hogue's murder, and she didn't hold back on details. Luffy told investigators that the day Hogue went missing, she was at Charbonneau's home when they got into a fight. As she tried to leave, Charbonneau began kicking and punching her and eventually tied her to a wheelchair. According to court documents, while she was in the wheelchair, the defendant and Brandy went and collected shovels, tarps, pickaxe, and a firearm. Then, with her still tied to the wheelchair, lifted the chair into the back of the vehicle. Charbonneau then drove both Hogue and Luffy to a secluded area in a rural part of the county. Once there, Charbonneau began digging a grave as he forced Hogue to watch. Once the shallow grave had been dug, Charbonneau allegedly shot Hogue in the head. He then spent the rest of the day burying her in the grave, covering her with large rocks and tree limbs. Brandy stayed at the vehicle and was a watch-out for any persons that may come. After Luffy confessed all this to authorities, she led investigators to Hogue's body. Hogue was found partially decomposed with an obvious bullet wound to her head. Anytime we talk about the brutality that's described in this case, we're of course horrified. But then again, we consistently hear about cases, particularly in domestic violence cases, where the crimes are so horrific, we can't believe this is what our society has come to. To understand what led up to Hogue's murder, we sat down with law and crime legal analyst Julie Rendelman. Let's talk about the domestic abuse side of things, because in this case, it seemed that the couple, the defendant and then the victim, had a history, a relationship, and it involved some domestic abuse. There were red flags leading up to that. I think part of the motive is going to be, particularly if this is a case that goes to a jury, that this was not an isolated incident, that this is something that built up over time. And it's also going to be a way for them to show that he is, in fact, a person that is responsible, as he's someone that had this history with her in the past, and it simply continued into the events that led to her death. Domestic assault in general is really horrific and unfortunate that so many people are involved in a situation like that. But this almost escalated to the next level in the fact that she was restrained to this wheelchair and then had to watch her own grave be dug. That's something I've never heard before. Anytime an individual is killed, particularly in a domestic violence scenario, it's horrifying. No one wants to imagine these are the type of things that happen. When you hear about a case like this, where it's so deliberate, where he put this woman through literally hell and back for shooting her. It's hard to even imagine what kind of human being is capable of doing that. Remember, he not only beats her while his new girlfriend is standing by assisting, but he ties her to a wheelchair, he brings her out to the woods, he and his girlfriend dig a grave while she watches, and then ultimately shoot and kill her. Now obviously, we know none of this is proven beyond a reasonable doubt, so we're always cautious when we talk about these cases, but this is what the allegations are. But if they are true, then it's hard to imagine what type of human being is capable of this. After Luffy's confession, both she and Charbonneau were charged with multiple offenses. Charbonneau faces charges of first-degree murder, first-degree domestic assault, first-degree kidnapping, abandonment of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and conspiracy to commit a felony. Luffy's charges are slightly different. Second-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, abandonment of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and conspiracy to commit a felony. In terms of charges, the boyfriend faces a first-degree murder charge, among others, and his girlfriend a second-degree murder charge. He's the person that fired the shot, that he's the person that, in a sense, planned these events. Then yes, there's a reason that they're distinguishing his actions versus her action. Now remember, she cooperates. One would assume that she's going to be getting a very good deal or a much better deal than she would have gotten if she didn't. And so while she's charged with second degree, at the end of the day, she may end up pleading guilty to something that benefits her even more if the end result is going after the person that the prosecution believes is the person that actually pulled the trigger. But if we're looking at the most severe charge in this case, first-degree murder, there's one major factor to consider. To me, this shows a lot of premeditation, at least based on the allegations. The fact that he tied her up, transported her to this area in the middle of nowhere, and then dug a grave as she watched. I mean, at any point he could have turned around the car, he could have unlatched her from this wheelchair or stopped digging a grave. Remember, a lot of times with murder cases, you don't need premeditation in order to prove the murder. In fact, sometimes you only need to have premeditation for a moment in time prior to the murder to be able to prove it. Here you have someone that is so deliberate, so calculating in the decisions they made. By the way, even bringing her out to a field to take her away from his own home to make sure that she wouldn't potentially be found is another indication not just of premeditation, but someone who is looking to get away with a horrific murder. Let's talk about the girlfriend, because she is a co-defendant. She was allegedly part of this murder. She's also the one who came forward to investigators and apparently confessed to what happened and laid out, here's what I did, here's what my boyfriend did. She's blaming the violent acts on him, and she's maybe putting herself more at the periphery, saying she was more the lookout, she helped, but she wasn't the person who fired the fatal shot. Then there's the question of why Hogu was murdered in the first place. And I know motive isn't something that we require in order to have a conviction. It's just something that we like to talk about a lot and honestly helpful for jurors at times to know why something happened. But in this case, is it something that prosecutors might look toward and say, okay, he probably had more of a motive to murder his ex-girlfriend rather than his current girlfriend who didn't have as much of a connection with the victim? Sometimes people say, well, the girlfriend has more of a motive because maybe she's jealous of the relationship. Remember, there's at least some evidence that it was the deceased that was at her ex's home at the time the alleged incident began. But yes, you're right, motive is not required. And remember, we've talked many times where there's times where individuals will kill someone because they gave them a look that they didn't like. And that was enough to cause their death. Here, I think when we talk about the motive is potentially going to go back to that domestic violence. This is a person that is out of control. In a sense, what the prosecutors are going to say is this is the person that did all the domestic violence to her in the past, not the ex-girlfriend. Now, they have to be careful. Remember, because you can't have someone's prior acts, because someone violently hit someone in the past, because someone assaulted them, doesn't mean that they committed a murder. So there has to be a balance, and a judge is going to have to determine that balance. Prejudice, and whether the probative value outweighs the prejudice, in terms of how much of that prior domestic violence history will come in. Since their arrests on August 2nd, both defendants have been held in the Washington County Jail. As of right now, both of the defendants are being held on $1 million cash bond. Do you think that's an appropriate amount? We always talk about this, because in New York, if someone was charged with the crimes that we just saw, who had a history of domestic violence, they would be remanded. There would be no $1 million bail. There would not even be a $2 million bail. So I'm always shocked to hear that. With that said, one could only assume that the basis of the judge setting this bail is the awareness that he won't be able to make the bail. He hasn't been able to make the bail. So the assumption is that that's kind of where the judge fell. But I'm always shocked to not hear that in a case of this magnitude, defendant is not remanded and held without bail. Looking ahead, Charbonneau is set to appear in Washington County Court on August 28th for a preliminary hearing.